Christmas Eve arrived quietly for her that year. There were no grand preparations, no overflowing joy, no sense of celebration filling the air. The lights were on, the calendar marked the date, but inside her, something felt distant, as if the night were passing by without truly touching her. She had imagined Christmas Eve differently in the past. Fuller. Warmer. Surrounded by meaning. But this year, it arrived carrying a softness that bordered on emptiness. Not painful enough to break her, just heavy enough to be felt. She moved through the evening slowly, aware of the contrast between what the world celebrated and what she carried inside. Familiar melodies played somewhere in the background, reminders of traditions and togetherness, yet they stirred more reflection than comfort. There was a quiet vulnerability in the air that night. The kind that surfaces when the year is ending and there is nowhere left to hide from what didn't turn out as expected. She felt the weight of unanswered prayers, postponed hopes, and moments she had imagined would look different by now. She didn't feel bitter. She felt reflective. As if Christmas Eve had invited her to sit with herself rather than distract herself. The stillness wasn't empty. It was attentive, waiting for something to surface. She wondered how many Christmas Eves had passed this way without her noticing. How often she had filled the space with noise instead of listening. This time, there was nothing to fill it with. Only presence. Outside, lights glowed softly, signaling celebration, warmth, and connection. Inside, she felt suspended between gratitude and longing, unsure which one would speak louder that night. She didn't expect anything from this evening. No sign. No reassurance. No miracle. Christmas Eve, she believed, was simply another moment to pass through quietly. She had no idea that this very night, gentle, unassuming, and stripped of expectation, was about to offer her something she had never thought to ask for. Because sometimes, the miracle of Christmas Eve doesn't arrive wrapped in joy or certainty. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet, exactly where we least expect it. As the evening unfolded, the quiet became more pronounced. Christmas Eve had a way of amplifying what was already present inside her, and that night it magnified a sense of solitude she hadn't fully acknowledged. It wasn't the absence of people that weighed on her, but the absence of expectation. She had stopped hoping for anything to feel different. She sat with memories of other years, moments when she believed things would eventually align, when she trusted that time itself would resolve what felt unfinished. Now, surrounded by the softness of the night, she felt the fatigue of carrying those hopes alone. Not defeated, just tired. There was a subtle fear beneath the stillness. A fear that this might be how it would always feel, quiet, unresolved, gently incomplete. She didn't fight the feeling. She let it exist, aware that resisting it would only deepen the ache. She wondered how many people were feeling the same way at that exact moment, sitting in different rooms, under different lights, carrying similar unspoken emotions. The thought didn't comfort her, but it connected her to something larger than her own experience. If you're listening to this now and something in her story feels familiar, you're not alone. Maybe this Christmas Eve has also felt heavier than expected. Maybe you've carried more than you've shared. If this touches something inside you, take a moment and comment the word miracle below, not as a declaration, but as an opening. She realized that part of her had stopped believing in small miracles altogether. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet ones that arrive without announcement. The kind that don't change everything at once, but change how you feel inside your own life. If this story is meeting you where you are, consider staying. Subscribe to the channel to receive more stories like this, reflections meant to accompany you through moments that are tender, uncertain, and deeply human. She also thought of people who might be sitting in silence tonight, wishing someone would reach out or understand without explanation. If someone comes to mind, share this video with them. Sometimes presence arrives through a simple gesture. She took a slow breath, unaware that even acknowledging her loneliness had already shifted something within her. The night didn't feel warmer yet, but it felt more honest. And honesty, she sensed, was the beginning of whatever miracle Christmas Eve still held. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to stay open. As the night deepened, she became more aware of everything that had quietly accumulated within her throughout the year. Christmas Eve had a way of slowing time just enough for unfinished emotions to surface. There was no urgency anymore, no distraction left to postpone what wanted to be felt. She thought about the moments she had carried alone, believing she would eventually understand them later. The conversations she rehearsed but never had. The hopes she adjusted so they wouldn't hurt as much. The faith she kept, even when it felt fragile. All of it lived within her now, asking for recognition. The glow of the lights around her felt symbolic, almost reflective. They illuminated the room, yet they also revealed the shadows she usually ignored. Not shadows of fear, but of longing. Longing for reassurance. Longing for meaning. Longing for something to gently remind her that this year had not been wasted. She realized how often she had been strong when she needed to be held, patient when she needed to be heard, composed when she needed to be comforted. These realizations didn't overwhelm her. They softened her. They allowed her to see herself with compassion rather than judgment. The silence around her was no longer empty. It felt attentive, as if the night itself were listening. She didn't speak out loud. She didn't ask for anything specific. She simply allowed herself to be present with what was true. She noticed how rarely she allowed herself to rest without explanation. To sit without planning the next step. Christmas Eve, in its quiet insistence, offered her that permission. To pause. To breathe. To exist without needing to justify where she was in life. Memories surfaced not as regrets, but as reminders of how much she had endured. How many times she had kept going even when clarity felt distant. There was strength in that realization, even if it arrived wrapped in tenderness. She sensed that something within her was shifting, not dramatically, but steadily. A gentle opening. A willingness to receive rather than manage. The idea felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. She did not yet know what Christmas Eve would bring. She did not expect answers or signs. But she felt the quiet sense that this night was not finished with her yet. And somewhere beneath the stillness, a presence began to form, subtle, patient, and unexpected, preparing to meet her in a way she could never have planned. As the night deepened, she became more aware of everything that had quietly accumulated within her throughout the year. Christmas Eve had a way of slowing time just enough for unfinished emotions to surface. There was no urgency anymore, no distraction left to postpone what wanted to be felt. She thought about the moments she had carried alone, believing she would eventually understand them later. The conversations she rehearsed but never had. The hopes she adjusted so they wouldn't hurt as much. The faith she kept, even when it felt fragile. All of it lived within her now, asking for recognition. The glow of the lights around her felt symbolic, almost reflective. They illuminated the room, yet they also revealed the shadows she usually ignored. Not shadows of fear, but of longing. Longing for reassurance. Longing for meaning. Longing for something to gently remind her that this year had not been wasted. She realized how often she had been strong when she needed to be held, patient when she needed to be heard, composed when she needed to be comforted. These realizations didn't overwhelm her. They softened her. They allowed her to see herself with compassion rather than judgment. The silence around her was no longer empty. It felt attentive, as if the night itself were listening. She didn't speak out loud. She didn't ask for anything specific. She simply allowed herself to be present with what was true. She noticed how rarely she allowed herself to rest without explanation. To sit without planning the next step. Christmas Eve, in its quiet insistence, offered her that permission. To pause. To breathe. To exist without needing to justify where she was in life. Memories surfaced not as regrets, but as reminders of how much she had endured. How many times she had kept going even when clarity felt distant. There was strength in that realization, even if it arrived wrapped in tenderness. She sensed that something within her was shifting, not dramatically, but steadily. A gentle opening. A willingness to receive rather than manage. The idea felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. She did not yet know what Christmas Eve would bring. She did not expect answers or signs. But she felt the quiet sense that this night was not finished with her yet. And somewhere beneath the stillness, a presence began to form, subtle, patient, and unexpected, preparing to meet her in a way she could never have planned. As Christmas Eve continued to unfold, she became aware of how much she had brought into that night without realizing it. Not bags or preparations, but the emotional weight of an entire year. Every compromise she had made, every moment she had stayed quiet when she wanted to speak, every hope she had carefully adjusted so it wouldn't hurt as much now rested with her in the stillness. She noticed how easily she had learned to move forward without pause, telling herself that momentum was the same as healing. She had crossed difficult days by staying busy, by focusing on what needed to be done rather than on what needed to be felt. Christmas Eve, however, did not allow that strategy to work. It asked her to slow down and meet herself honestly. There was a tenderness in recognizing how much effort it had taken simply to keep going. She hadn't been dramatic about her struggles. She hadn't demanded attention. She had carried them quietly, believing that resilience meant invisibility. Seeing this clearly did not weaken her. It softened her toward herself. She reflected on the moments she had waited for reassurance that never arrived. The times she had trusted that things would eventually make sense, even when clarity felt distant. That trust had not disappeared, but it had grown tired. Christmas Eve seemed to offer her permission to admit that tiredness without judgment. The silence around her held that admission gently. It did not rush her toward gratitude or optimism. It allowed her to acknowledge disappointment without labeling it failure. That allowance felt rare and necessary. She realized how often she had postponed receiving comfort, telling herself it would come later, once things improved or resolved. Tonight, there was no later. There was only this moment, asking to be met as it was. Her heart felt exposed in a way she wasn't accustomed to, but not unsafe. Vulnerability did not feel like collapse. It felt like honesty, finally given space to exist without being corrected. She sensed that something within her was ready to release control, even if only briefly. The constant effort to manage outcomes loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet willingness to receive whatever this night might offer. Christmas Eve no longer felt like a test she needed to pass. It felt like a container, holding her exactly where she was. And within that container, something subtle began to shift, as if the night itself were preparing to respond to the openness she had allowed. She did not yet know how the miracle would arrive. She only knew that, for the first time that evening, she was no longer bracing herself against the night. She was meeting it. She wasn't searching for a sign when it happened. That was what made the moment feel so different from everything else she had experienced before. There was no urgency in her heart, no demand placed on the night, no silent negotiation with the universe. She was simply present, allowing Christmas Eve to unfold without expectation. The moment arrived quietly, almost disguised as something ordinary. A notification lit up her phone, soft and unassuming, breaking the stillness in a way that felt gentle rather than intrusive. She almost ignored it, assuming it was just another message that could wait. Something, however, urged her to look. The message was brief, written without flourish or drama. It did not promise solutions or explanations. Yet the words reached her with unexpected precision, touching a place inside her she had not articulated out loud. It felt less like information and more like recognition. She read it once, then again, slower the second time. The simplicity of the message contrasted sharply with the depth of what it stirred within her. It didn't tell her what to do. It didn't ask for anything. It simply reminded her that she was seen. Her breath caught slightly as she felt something shift inside her chest. Not excitement, not relief, but a quiet release. The kind that happens when something heavy loosens without resistance. She hadn't realized how much she needed to feel acknowledged until that moment arrived. She looked around the room, as if expecting something else to change alongside her. The lights were the same. The silence remained. Yet the atmosphere felt subtly altered, as though the night had leaned closer in response to her openness. The message did not solve her questions or erase her uncertainties. What it did was far more subtle. It interrupted the story she had been carrying about being unseen, about sitting alone in her struggles. It offered a different possibility, one she had not allowed herself to consider. She felt a warmth rise slowly, not overwhelming, but steady. A reassurance that did not demand belief, only presence. The kind of reassurance that feels less like hope and more like grounding. Christmas Eve no longer felt empty. It felt attentive. As if something had heard her without being asked and responded without needing to announce itself. She didn't yet understand what this moment would become. She only knew that the night had answered back, and nothing inside her felt quite the same after that. After the message, she didn't rush to respond. She placed the phone beside her and allowed the moment to breathe. Something about that pause felt important, as if the meaning needed space to settle before it could be understood. The silence that returned was no longer the same silence she had been sitting with earlier. She noticed how her body responded before her thoughts did. Her shoulders softened. Her breathing slowed. The tightness she had been carrying without realizing began to loosen, not all at once, but enough to be felt. It was as if her system had registered safety before her mind could explain why. She replayed the words quietly in her memory, not searching for hidden meaning, but letting them land where they naturally wanted to land. The message didn't change her circumstances, yet it changed how she felt inside them. That distinction felt important, even if she couldn't fully articulate it yet. She realized that what had touched her most was not what the message said, but how it arrived. Unplanned. Unforced. Timed with such precision that it felt intentional without being dramatic. It felt like response rather than coincidence. Her thoughts slowed, no longer looping around the same unanswered questions. For the first time that evening, she wasn't trying to make sense of the year or anticipate what came next. She was simply present with the feeling of having been met. She became aware of a subtle trust forming beneath the surface. Not the kind that demands certainty, but the kind that allows space. A trust that whispered that maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone, even if she didn't yet know how support would show up. The room felt warmer now, though nothing physical had changed. The lights glowed the same. The night remained quiet. Yet the atmosphere carried a softness that hadn't been there before, as if the evening itself had shifted in response to her openness. She reflected on how rarely she allowed herself to receive without questioning. How quickly she usually searched for logic or explanation. This time, she resisted that impulse. She allowed the moment to exist without being dissected. Christmas Eve no longer felt like something she was enduring. It felt like something she was participating in. The difference was subtle, but profound. She was no longer a witness to her own life. She was inside it. She didn't know yet what this message would lead to or how it would shape the days ahead. But she sensed that something had already been set in motion, quietly and gently, simply by allowing herself to receive. As the minutes passed, she noticed that Christmas Eve no longer felt suspended in uncertainty. The night had not become brighter or louder, yet it carried a different texture. What once felt heavy now felt spacious, as if something invisible had shifted the emotional weight she had been holding. She moved through the room slowly, aware of how present she felt inside her own body. Every small gesture carried intention. Every breath felt grounded. The message had not demanded action, but it had invited awareness, and that awareness changed how she experienced the moment. She sensed that whatever had reached her was not meant to be analyzed or solved. It was meant to be received. The simplicity of that realization surprised her. She had spent so much of her life trying to understand before trusting, waiting for clarity before allowing herself to feel supported. This time, the order felt reversed. She became aware of subtle signs around her that she might have overlooked before. A familiar song playing softly nearby, its lyrics suddenly resonating differently. The warmth of the lights reflecting off the window. The quiet steadiness of the night itself. None of it felt accidental anymore. There was no dramatic emotion rising within her. No rush of excitement or certainty. Instead, there was calm. A grounded calm that felt earned rather than imagined. It didn't erase her questions, but it softened their edges. She felt a gentle openness where tension had been. A sense that even if nothing else happened that night, something important had already taken place. She had allowed herself to receive without resistance, and that alone felt significant. Her thoughts returned briefly to the message, not to reread it, but to acknowledge what it had initiated. A shift in orientation. A quiet willingness to trust the unfolding rather than manage it. She understood that miracles did not always announce themselves through visible change. Sometimes, they arrived as internal alignment, altering how you stand inside your own life before anything external responds. Christmas Eve continued quietly, but she no longer felt alone within it. The night felt companionable now, as if something unseen had taken a seat beside her and chosen to stay. And with that awareness, she allowed herself to rest into the remainder of the evening, trusting that whatever had begun did not need to be rushed. When she finally allowed herself to sit again, she noticed something that surprised her. The familiar tension that usually returned after moments of calm did not come back. The peace she felt was not fragile. It stayed, steady and unforced, as if it had settled into her rather than passing through. She picked up her phone once more, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Another message appeared, unrelated yet strangely aligned. A simple holiday greeting from someone she had not spoken to in a long time. It carried no agenda, no explanation, just warmth. She smiled softly, sensing a pattern forming without being announced. Her thoughts drifted to earlier moments in the year when she had asked for clarity and received silence instead. Now, silence felt different. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, making room for something to arrive naturally rather than be forced. She noticed how her body responded to this shift before her mind could interpret it. Her posture felt lighter. Her chest felt open. The constant readiness to brace herself had quietly dissolved, replaced by a grounded sense of ease. Even the memories of what had felt heavy earlier that evening seemed less charged. They were still there, but they no longer defined her emotional state. She could look at them without being pulled back into their weight. She realized that these signs were not dramatic enough to convince doubt, yet they were undeniable in how they made her feel. They were not meant to prove anything. They were meant to reassure. Christmas Eve continued with its gentle rhythm, but now she felt accompanied by a quiet certainty that something was aligning beneath the surface. Not everything was resolved, yet nothing felt threatening. She understood that these were the kinds of miracles people often overlooked. The ones that arrived as emotional relief, as softened perception, as unexpected ease in moments that once felt heavy. And as the night moved forward, she allowed herself to trust that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted, and the universe, in its quiet way, was responding. As the night moved closer to midnight, she became aware of how differently she was experiencing time. The restlessness that usually accompanied moments of uncertainty was absent. Instead, there was a sense of alignment, as if her inner world had quietly adjusted its rhythm to match something steadier. She reflected on how rarely she allowed herself to trust a moment without immediately questioning it. Tonight felt different. The calm she carried did not feel temporary or imagined. It felt rooted, as though it had found a place to stay within her. She noticed how her thoughts no longer raced ahead in search of answers. They moved slowly, deliberately, no longer demanding immediate resolution. This spaciousness allowed her to feel grounded in the present rather than suspended in anticipation. She sensed that something within her had shifted from waiting to receiving. Not receiving outcomes or guarantees, but receiving the moment as it was. That shift changed how she related to everything around her. Her body mirrored this change. The subtle tension she had lived with for so long no longer dictated her posture or breath. She felt at ease within herself, as if she had stopped resisting the unfolding of the night. She understood now that alignment did not require certainty. It required presence. It required trust without explanation. That realization felt like a quiet revelation, one that did not need to be shared to be meaningful. Christmas Eve no longer felt like a test of faith or endurance. It felt like a gentle confirmation that something unseen was supporting her, even if it did not announce itself loudly. She allowed herself to acknowledge this support without fear of losing it. She did not cling to it. She simply stayed open, allowing the feeling to integrate naturally. The night continued to hold her softly, and she sensed that whatever had begun was unfolding exactly as it needed to. Not rushed. Not delayed. Simply aligned. She didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew something important had already changed. She was no longer waiting for life to meet her. She was meeting it fully, exactly where she was. As midnight approached, she noticed how naturally trust had begun to take root within her. Not as a belief she forced herself to adopt, but as a feeling that had quietly settled in. It felt less like hope and more like recognition, as if something familiar had returned to her awareness. She reflected on how often she had equated trust with certainty, believing she needed proof before allowing herself to relax. This night had shown her something different. Trust did not require answers. It required presence. It required willingness to remain open even when the path ahead was not yet visible. Her thoughts softened as she considered the year that was ending. The moments that once felt unresolved no longer demanded closure. They simply became part of a larger unfolding, one that no longer felt random or disconnected. She sensed that the message she had received was not meant to stand alone. It was a doorway rather than a destination. What mattered was not the words themselves, but the opening they created within her. The quiet around her felt supportive now, almost protective. The silence no longer echoed with absence. It carried a gentle assurance that she was being held, even if she could not explain how or by whom. She realized that this was how miracles often worked. They did not arrive to overwhelm or convince. They arrived to remind. To reorient. To gently realign us with something we had momentarily forgotten. Her body felt grounded, steady, as if it trusted the floor beneath her in a new way. That grounding allowed her to remain present without scanning the future for reassurance. Christmas Eve no longer felt like a threshold she needed to cross alone. It felt like a passage she was being guided through, step by step, without urgency or demand. She allowed herself to acknowledge this guidance without questioning its legitimacy. She did not analyze it. She did not test it. She simply let it be. And as the night continued its quiet progression, she understood something clearly for the first time. She did not need to see the entire path ahead to trust that she was moving in the right direction. As the night deepened, she sensed something subtle beginning to unfold beyond the moment itself. It wasn't a vision of the future or a sudden certainty about what would come next. It was softer than that. It was the feeling that the future no longer felt closed. She noticed how her thoughts about tomorrow carried less weight than they usually did. They were no longer loaded with fear or expectation. They felt neutral, open, almost curious. That curiosity felt like a quiet victory, replacing the tension she had once carried into every unknown. She reflected on how much energy she had spent anticipating disappointment, preparing herself emotionally so that outcomes wouldn't hurt as much. Tonight, that pattern felt unnecessary. Not because disappointment was impossible, but because she trusted herself to remain supported even if things unfolded differently than planned. There was a sense of internal permission growing within her. Permission to imagine without attachment. Permission to want without fear. Permission to let life surprise her instead of bracing against it. That permission felt expansive, as if something inside her had taken a fuller breath. She realized that the miracle of this night was not confined to Christmas Eve itself. It was already extending beyond it, subtly influencing how she related to what lay ahead. The year ahead no longer felt like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could meet. Her posture shifted again, almost imperceptibly. She stood differently within her own thoughts, less guarded, less contracted. The future no longer appeared as a list of challenges waiting to be solved, but as a landscape she could walk into with presence. She sensed that this openness was not fragile. It did not depend on circumstances remaining calm or favorable. It was rooted in something deeper, something internal that had quietly realigned. The message she had received earlier no longer felt like an isolated moment. It felt like the beginning of a conversation that would continue unfolding over time, revealing itself through experience rather than explanation. Christmas Eve was nearing its end, but the shift within her was just beginning. She felt that clearly now. Whatever had awakened inside her was not bound to a date or a moment. It was becoming part of how she lived. And as she allowed herself to sit with that knowing, she felt a gentle readiness form within her. Not readiness for answers, but readiness for life itself. When Christmas Eve finally gave way to morning, she noticed how different she felt waking up. The world had not changed overnight, but her way of meeting it had. There was a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before, a quiet steadiness that followed her into the new day. She moved through the morning without the familiar weight of anticipation. Tasks felt simpler. Thoughts felt clearer. Even the small decisions of the day no longer carried the pressure they once did. It was as if something inside her had stopped resisting the flow of life. She began to notice how easily moments aligned when she wasn't forcing outcomes. Conversations unfolded naturally. Opportunities appeared without effort. Help arrived in subtle ways that felt timely rather than coincidental. None of it felt dramatic, yet all of it felt intentional. She realized that the miracle of Christmas Eve was continuing, not as a single event, but as a shift in orientation. She was no longer approaching life from lack or defensiveness. She was meeting it with openness, and life responded accordingly. Her confidence grew quietly, without performance. She trusted her intuition more easily now, sensing when to act and when to wait. This trust brought clarity, and that clarity brought peace. She reflected on how different her days felt when she wasn't bracing for disappointment. Even challenges felt more manageable. They no longer threatened her sense of safety or worth. They became part of the unfolding rather than obstacles against it. The message she had received on Christmas Eve lingered in her awareness, not as words she repeated, but as a feeling she carried. A feeling of being supported, even when things were uncertain. She noticed how her relationships felt lighter too. She listened more deeply. She spoke more honestly. There was less effort in being herself, and more ease in being present. She understood now that miracles don't always change what happens. Sometimes, they change how we experience what happens. And that change can transform everything. As the days continued to unfold, she felt grateful not for outcomes, but for alignment. For the quiet knowing that she was no longer walking forward alone, even when she walked in silence. As the days turned into weeks, she began to notice how life responded to her in ways she hadn't experienced before. Not loudly, not all at once, but consistently. Doors that once felt closed now opened with ease. Conversations led to unexpected invitations. Ideas she had quietly held gained form and direction. People started to notice her presence differently. Not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer moved through the world invisibly. There was a calm confidence in how she spoke, listened, and showed up. That confidence drew others toward her naturally. She received messages of appreciation, words of recognition she hadn't known she needed. Some came from people who had watched her journey quietly. Others came from places she never expected. Each one felt like a gentle affirmation rather than validation she depended on. Opportunities began to align in ways that felt meaningful rather than overwhelming. She felt guided toward what resonated and gently redirected away from what no longer did. This discernment made her path feel intentional instead of reactive. She realized that the miracle of Christmas Eve had not simply comforted her. It had recalibrated how she related to herself and the world. That recalibration allowed life to meet her with the same clarity and respect she now offered herself. She no longer questioned whether she deserved what was unfolding. She received it with gratitude, grounded in the knowing that alignment creates space for expansion. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt forced. Her story began to inspire others, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was honest. People saw themselves reflected in her journey, and that reflection created connection. If this story has spoken to something inside you, allow yourself to stay with it. You're welcome to leave a comment sharing what this moment stirred within you, and subscribe if you feel called to continue this journey of reflection and quiet transformation together. She understood now that recognition was not the goal. Alignment was. And recognition, when it arrived, was simply a reflection of the work she had already done within herself. As she continued forward, she carried this knowing with her: when you change how you meet life, life changes how it meets you. With time, she understood that the miracle of Christmas Eve was not something that belonged only to that night. It was not a memory meant to fade or a feeling meant to be revisited only during special moments. It had become something she carried, quietly shaping how she moved through the world. She noticed how her reactions had softened. Situations that once triggered anxiety now invited reflection. Moments that once felt overwhelming now felt manageable. Not because life had become easier, but because she had become more present within it. She trusted herself differently now. She no longer doubted her inner signals or dismissed her intuition. There was a steadiness in how she listened inwardly, a sense of alignment that guided her choices without pressure or force. She realized that what she had received on Christmas Eve was not reassurance about outcomes. It was reassurance about herself. About her ability to remain open, grounded, and connected even when answers were not immediately visible. This understanding changed how she related to uncertainty. She no longer saw it as a threat, but as a space where life could meet her in unexpected ways. That shift alone felt miraculous. She felt gratitude rise naturally, not because everything was perfect, but because everything felt meaningful. Even the challenges carried purpose now, shaping her rather than breaking her. She understood that miracles are not always external events. Sometimes they are internal realignments that quietly influence everything that follows. Christmas Eve had offered her that gift without spectacle or demand. And in carrying this miracle forward, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging within her own life. Looking back, she knew that the miracle had arrived the moment she stopped resisting the night and allowed herself to be present within it. Christmas Eve had met her not with answers, but with recognition. And that recognition changed everything. She understood now that the same kind of miracle is always available. Not only on Christmas Eve, not only during moments of stillness, but whenever someone allows themselves to remain open rather than guarded. If this story reached you now, it may not be coincidence. Perhaps something inside you is also ready to soften. Ready to trust. ready to receive in a way that doesn't require proof or certainty. You don't need to wait for the perfect moment or the perfect sign. Sometimes, the miracle arrives when you stop asking the night to be different and allow it to meet you exactly as it is. If this story touched your heart, you're invited to leave a word in the comments that represents what you're opening yourself to subscribe if you want to continue walking through stories like this, and to share this video with someone who may need this reminder tonight. The miracle of Christmas Eve was never meant to belong only to her. It was meant to remind you too. Sometimes, all it takes is one quiet night, one open moment, and one willingness to receive what has been waiting for you all along.